The United Nations in the Cold War background. The UN had been planned in the Atlantic Charter of 1941 and wanted to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation in solving problems, and act as a center for collective action. The UN essentially had the same purpose as the League of Nations, as both of their goals was to maintain and keep peace. The UN had a General Assembly to act as a forum for discussion for all member states, and no matter how small the state was, it had a vote. But the Security Council was the most powerful organization, as was the executive body, and had veto power. Initially, there were 4 permanent members, including the Security Council, USA, UK, USSR, and China, later rising to 5 with the inclusion of France. Main principles of the United Nations. The main principles of the UN was for it to be a form of discussion and decision, meet as a syndicate for action, employ non-forcible methods to improve the world, and to spread moral values and higher standards in international relations. One of the biggest problems of the UN was the ideological differences between the 2 superpowers of the US and the USSR, as it made it difficult to come up with decisions. Key principles of the United Nations Charter. The first UN principle was the collective security principle, and was made up of members that were to take effective collective measures to prevent and remove the threats to peace, to suppress the aggressive acts. The Security Council had the call for action and did not allow for intervention in domestic matters. The regional principle was the development of regional arrangements or agencies for dealing with threats to peace in a region, as long as they worked in line with UN principles. The association principle set down that all peace-loving states could be members of the UN, which led to the US and the USSR's dispute, as they couldn't agree on which states qualified as peace-loving states. The American expectations. The American expectations of the UN was to create a new institution for the UN to support US values and to promote only moderate and constructive change, suppress revolutionary and violent change, and for the UN to implement US-style economic objectives, which were to be used in a global free market. The Soviet expectations. The Soviet expectations were very difficult and had very high and unrealistic expectations. The Soviets wanted to use the UN to promote ideological beliefs and saw the UN as preventing a future world war. The Soviets also wanted revolutionary change, but wanted to have balance of power and were suspicious of UN's charter and of the International Court of Justice, as they appeared to support capitalist principles. They also saw the UN's role as more marginal than expressed in the initial hopes of the US. The United Nations and the emergence of the Cold War. The Cold War developed between the US and the USSR, and it was hard for the UN to maintain peacekeeping, as the UN would have the peacekeeping role in the Cold War. Korea from 1950 to 1953. Here, the UN sent military force to Korea in response to the invasion of the South Korea by the North in 1950. On November 3rd in 1950, the General Assembly passed the Uniting for Peace resolution, where it stated that decisions over security could be transferred to the General Assembly when action by the Security Council was blocked by veto, which made the Soviets mad. The Suez Canal Crisis of 1956. Here, the UN's role was seen more favorably, as the General Assembly created a peacekeeping force called the United Nations Emergency Force, which was successful as British and French troops had been withdrawn successfully. The Hungarian Uprising of 1956. During this time, the UN failed as it was too busy focusing on the Middle East rather than Europe at the time, and because the USSR vetoed the Security Council resolution, which requested the Soviet withdrawal from Hungary. The Cold War had a negative impact on the early years of the UN, as it failed to act during the Soviet invasion in Hungary and failed to act against American interference in the international affairs. During the 1950s, the UN had to achieve the withdrawal of Belgian forces and had to restore public order, defend a UN force, and prevent the crisis from drawing in the superpowers. It was directly caught up in the international politics in the Congo, demonstrating how it could cause the situation to deteriorate even further.
The non-aligned countries were those that rejected any alliances with either the USA or USSR. They were also called the Third World, because they had decided to choose the path less taken, or the third path. Instead of allying with the superpowers, they avoided being involved in any Cold War politics. During the Cold War, decolonization movements in Africa and Asia arose. The imperial powers that had been colonizing these estates were so devastated by the Second World War that they couldn't withhold power any longer. This meant that these countries were now independent, and as would be normal, were totally anti-imperialist and against imperialistic regimes. This presented a problem to the US, since it could be perceived as anti-American. Once the decolonization had taken place, a movement formed, the Non-Aligned Movement. This organization was formed by all those countries that were non-aligned and led by the leaders of these countries. The US had worried that the movement was anti-American and anti-Western, but it soon became known that many of the leaders of the non-aligned movement were anti-Soviet as much as they were anti-imperialistic. The only criteria any state had to follow to be in the organization was that they must not ally with any of the superpowers. As the NAM grew, and the number of states involved in it increased, their relevance in the UN also increased. The balance of power in the UN had clearly been pro-Western because the majority of the countries of the Security Council had Western democracies. But the non-aligned states balanced out the power in a more neutral way because of their indifference. The non-aligned movement was divided into two groups. The non-alignment group of 115 states, which was formed in Belgrade in 1961, and the Group of 77, which was formed in Geneva in 1964. The non-alignment group worked to influence and help with economic and political crisis, while the Group of 77 tried to influence the bigger powers and industrialized countries to help other non-aligned states that lived in poverty. Both of these groups had different points of view and weren't very united, but they sometimes worked together to achieve common objectives in the General Assembly. The two most important and powerful countries in the NAM were China and India. Both of these countries had their reasons to avoid allying with the superpowers. The USA had backed Pakistan when India was divided, and instead of responding with war, India joined the NAM as a way of striking back. China, on the other hand, just did not want to continue under the influence of the superpowers. By the 1960s, the movement was being taken more seriously by the rest of the world because of the magnitude of the movement. Disaster struck when in 1962 the Sino-Indian War broke out. The two most important countries in the NAM were in war, and in the eyes of the rest of the world, they lost credibility. In the 70s, all the original leaders of the countries involved in the movement were gone, and so was the enthusiasm. The neutrality of some of the states was being questioned because they had requested aid from the USSR, and technically were no longer neutral. Later on, in the 80s and 90s, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan made NAM states turn on themselves. Soviet aid had divided NAM, and while some states supported the invasion, others opposed it fiercely. By this time, the NAM had lost credibility and importance as a political and economic concept, but conferences and summits were still held. Since many of the states were undergoing radical political changes after the Cold War, the NAM shifted its focus to global economic problems. The NAM was a child of the Cold War. The period of 1968 to 1979 was a period of détente between the two superpowers, almost as if the Cold War was taking a break. Of course, they hoped it would last longer than it did. Détente meant the relaxation of the tension between the USA and the USSR. The main reason why was the fear of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. MAD basically meant that if they engaged in war, everybody would die, and in the end, it would have all been for nothing. With this fear in mind, both superpowers became more open to looking for peaceful solutions to the problems and to working with the UN's idea of peacekeeping. The USSR, who had previously been unhappy because of the amount of Western countries in the UN, calmed down considerably when the number of non-aligned states in the General Assembly increased dramatically, and even the balance of power. During détente, the UN had a small number of successes, such as reaching a ceasefire between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots. But even so, making big changes became very difficult because the USSR held the power to veto any decision. After this period, the USA and USSR resumed hostility and Détente ended. Once the Cold War had been resumed, the UN peacekeeping stopped, as when the powers got involved, there was little the UN could do.